A good translation is like a pane of glass. On the surface, this seems like a reasonable explanation for a good translation. It implies that the act of translation is transparent, that the translation reads as fluently as the original, and that it is imperfections or scratches and marks on the pane of glass that leads the reader to realise that they're reading a translation, and not a good one. However, due to the vastness of text type, translation methods, theories, and preferences, it's not always the case that scratches and marks are incorrect translations or imperfections. To explore this, I'll look at three discussion points within the field of translation studies: the concept of authorship, source versus target-oriented translations, and text types and their methods. I'll firstly look at the concept of authorship. In La mort de l'auteur, or The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, he discusses authorship in the wider field of literature. One of the questions he asks is who? Who should the term author be assigned to? He uses Proust as an example to explore this question. In his work À la recherche du temps perdu, or In Search of Lost Time, the idea of the narrator is one of the biggest issues throughout the novel. Who claims authorship? Is it Marcel, the little boy in the novel? Is it Marcel, the man in the novel? Is it Marcel Proust, the man outside of the novel? Or is it Marcel Proust, the writer? As well as this, a translation of a work adds another possibility. When thinking of a translation as a pane of glass, it should be assumed that the translator's presence is only to act as a channel through which the work travels to be expressed in another language, in other words, the conduit metaphor. Despite different opinions about this in the field of translation studies, I'm particularly interested in the idea of transparency and invisibility. And if there is any sign of the translator's own style or voice, is this an imperfection and therefore a bad translation? Venuti uses the term invisibility to describe translators' situation and activity in contemporary Anglo-American culture. Venuti goes on to say that what causes the transparency is the translator translating fluently into English to make it readable and idiomatic, i.e., reading as fluently in the target language as it did in the source language, which includes making sure that the original author's intention and meaning is conveyed and have not been changed in any way, therefore revealing the presence of the translator. One of the observations Venuti makes in this chapter, and the one that I find the most resonant with the metaphor in question, is that translation has rarely been considered a literary scholarship, and so concealing the act of translation is important. An example relating to this discussion point is a translator called Alison Waters. Her style and standpoint on translation is very much centered around the author. She says that she would most likely not proceed with a translation if she cannot fully render the voice of the original author, thus maintaining her invisibility. However, her personal preference is to translate pieces that have been written in the author's second or even third language. This to me poses an interesting challenge, as it raises other issues of invisibility which may jeopardize her authorial transparency. A book written by somebody who has chosen to write in a language other than their native one will no doubt contain differences in style and readability than if it were written by a native speaker. This would mean that she must make choices to either maintain some of the less natural sounding phrases, which will ultimately not have the reader at complete ease, or she can choose to smooth over some of the imperfections, which will ironically maintain her invisibility and the invisibility of the act of translation, yet not be completely loyal to the original. This leads on to the next issue that I'll be discussing, which is source versus target-oriented translations. In other words, domestication versus foreignization. Preferences of these issues have shifted over the years of translation studies. For this, I will again be using Venuti's definitions. Firstly, domestication brings the text to the reader. It involves an ethnocentric reduction of the original text, yet it allows the invisibility of the act of translation, as it minimizes the foreignness of the target culture for the target culture, and therefore allows the reader to be completely at ease. On the other hand, foreignization takes the reader to the text, or sends the reader abroad. The target culture values are not a priority. It values to register linguistic and cultural differences and makes the presence of the translator visible by highlighting the text's foreign identity. This ultimately means that the reader will be fully aware that they're reading a foreign work and will see cultural references, foreign names, and perhaps an element of the original author's style which may not conform to the target culture north. In terms of the metaphor in question, this type of translation would be a frosted pane of glass with many scratches and marks, as the act of translation and the presence of the translator is no secret. However, this does not mean that it's a bad translation. It is, in fact, the preferred style of many translators in order to educate and hold their own importance. The example I often turn to when discussing cultural references is Kif Kif Demain by Faiz again. She refers to supermarkets, French locations and hotels, and they all imply a stereotype of one kind that would not be obvious to a foreign reader. Ways to overcome this could be to find an equivalent in the target culture in order to avoid using extra explanations, and therefore, as Mona Baker puts it, leaves it to the translator's choice of appropriation. Keeping the original names is another option, but adding an explanation within the body of the text. Or alternatively, you could keep the original French names, but have footnotes, which is arguably the least transparent way to translate a text. In the example I look at, the translation by Sarah Adams, Just Like Tomorrow, she, in the first instance, chooses to remove the name of the supermarket altogether and generalise it as cheap wine, which works well and sounds fluent for the reader of the target text. For the hotel, to specify the type, she uses the word motel instead, which instantly has the same implication for the target text reader as for someone reading the original text, who knows Formula One. However, there is no explanation or change for Bagnolet, which is a town on the other side of the périphérique in Paris, and therefore for a French reader familiar with Paris, they would have an idea of the areas that the characters are frequenting, whereas a reader of the target text, who is not familiar, would not necessarily be able to come to the same conclusions. To me, keeping the French names in this case without an explanation does raise an issue for the target text reader, and does make the translation an issue. The two examples I've looked at so far are very focused on literature, so they have a more subjective and complex approach regarding transparency of a translation. Finally, I'm going to look at Katharina Ries's informative approach for informative texts. She's built her ideas from other people in the field of translation studies, and she settles on 4 categories of text type and method for each type of translation: informative, expressive, operative, and audio-medial. I'm particularly interested in an informative text for this discussion. So the method she suggests is a plain communication of facts. She says that the content or the topic of the text is the main focus. The translation should be written in plain prose with extra explicitation when necessary. In other words, a completely transparent translation with the utmost invisibility of the translator. In this instance, a scratch or mark would be a mistranslation or an incorrect expression of the facts. This assumes that even in the source text, the information is the priority and the idea of authorship is not present. However, this approach is criticised, and the observation has been made that its strongly informative text can also have an expressive or an operative side to it, and so the categories are not necessarily as clear-cut as they may seem. Within this field of text type, authenticity is also discussed alongside the idea of transparency, saying that it is the impression that it is not a translation and that it has been composed in the target language from the outset. In this notion of translation, it is this notion of translation that is used in EU institutions. They do not refer to translations as such, but instead language versions, implying that the act of translation is completely concealed and there would be no scratch or marks to suggest otherwise. Overall, it can be said that translation is not a black and white activity. Choices are often subjective, and sometimes choices about one issue will be challenged by another issue that's raised in the same text. Regarding the metaphor, a good translation is like a pane of glass, I would agree that in some cases, i.e. informative texts and translations within EU institutions, for example, should remain transparent, and any scratches or marks would be an incorrect translation. However, this is one of many areas of translation, and as seen in my first 2 discussion points, the presence of the translator and the evident act of translation does not mean that it's a bad translation, but can in fact provide an education of the source culture and a new reading experience for the reader of the target text.